Fired. Not quietly. Not in a private office with the door closed and a box of tissues on the table, but in the middle of a glass boardroom, 40 floors above the city, with every eye in the room watching her world come apart at the seams. That was the night Zara Collins lost everything she had spent years building. But it was also the night a man named Kai Weston said 4 words that stopped the entire room cold. And here is the part no one tells you about that night. Those 4 words were not a rescue. They were the beginning of something far more complicated and far more real. What nobody in that boardroom knew, including Zara, was that Kai Weston had read every single one of her case briefs for the past 2 years, not because it was required of him, not because someone asked him to, but because he had been watching her work and quietly making sure the right doors stayed open for her without her ever knowing his name. Remember that. It matters more than it seems right now. Zara Collins was 28 years old, and she did not arrive at Weston Capital through connections or family names or the right university friendships. She arrived through preparation, the kind that starts before sunrise and ends well after everyone else has gone home. She grew up watching her mother work double shifts at a reception desk and a laundry service simultaneously, always one step ahead of the next bill, never once complaining about it. And Zara had made herself a quiet promise, somewhere between childhood and adulthood, she would build something solid, something that belonged to her, something no one could take away. For 3 years, she had been the lead contracts attorney at Weston Capital, one of the most powerful investment firms in Manhattan. She was not the loudest person in any room she walked into. She never needed to be. She was simply the most prepared, and over time, the people who paid attention knew the difference. She arrived before everyone and stayed after everyone. She had never once asked to be recognized for it because she believed, with the particular quiet faith of someone who has never had anything handed to them, that the work would eventually speak loudly enough on its own. Tonight was supposed to be the proof of that. She had spent 6 weeks preparing the documents for a billion-dollar merger, a deal that involved 3 international parties and enough legal complexity to make most attorneys in the building quietly relieved it wasn't their file. But it was her file. She had asked for it. She had mapped every clause, anticipated every point of friction, and prepared contingency language for scenarios that hadn't even been raised yet. She walked into that boardroom with her folder, her notes, and the kind of composure that only comes from knowing you have done everything right. She had absolutely no idea what was coming. Director Harlan Reed had been at Weston Capital for 15 years. He was polished in the way that people become polished when they have spent a long time around money, smooth at the surface, careful about appearances, and deeply skilled at making other people's accomplishments look like extensions of his own leadership. He was Zara's direct supervisor, and she had spent 3 years being professionally courteous to a man she had quietly and accurately assessed within her first week on the job. He stood up mid-meeting. The international executives were already seated, the board members were already present, the room was already full, and he straightened his jacket and smiled the smile of someone who had been planning this moment for longer than the meeting had been scheduled. He announced, in a calm and carefully measured voice, that Zara Collins's employment at Weston Capital was being terminated effective immediately, due to a serious breach of confidentiality related to sensitive merger documents. The room went completely still. Zara felt something drop through her chest. Not panic, not yet, but the particular cold shock of hearing something so false, delivered so convincingly, that for one disorienting second, even she questioned her own memory. She had not breached anything. She knew every document she had touched and every person she had spoken to. She knew her own record the way she knew her own name, but the accusation was already in the air. And everyone in that room was watching her face. Harlan asked her, with a courteous tilt of his head, to surrender her access badge and leave the room. 40 people, every one of them watching. Zara stood there for one long, measured moment. 3 years of early mornings, 3 years of staying composed in rooms that were not always welcoming. There were 3 years of letting the work carry the weight of everything she could not say out loud. And now this, in public, in front of people who would carry this image of her out of the building tonight and into every future conversation about her name. She reached for her badge, The boardroom doors opened. Kai Weston did not make an entrance the way people in his position sometimes do, with deliberate timing or a practiced air of authority. He simply walked in, the way a person walks into a room they are entirely comfortable in, and he stopped. He was 30 years old, though he carried himself with a kind of quiet steadiness that had nothing to do with age. He was the CEO of Weston Capital, the firm his late father had built from 2 employees and a rented office into something that now occupied 4 floors of a Manhattan tower. But he wore that inheritance the way someone wears a coat they've had long enough to forget they're wearing it. It was his, and he was responsible with it, and that was the whole of his relationship to it. He had a small tattoo just visible above his collar, a detail that had generated more boardroom whispers than any business decision he'd ever made, and dark eyes that moved through a room with the particular attention of someone who notices things and says very little about what they've noticed. He took in the scene in approximately 3 seconds. Harlan's composed satisfaction, Zara's stillness, the badge in her hand, the watching room. And then, in a voice that was unhurried and completely level, he said, "Why is my wife still standing? Someone get her a chair." Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Zara looked at him, whilst he looked back at her with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing, and then he walked to the head of the table and sat down with the calm of a man who had not just detonated something extraordinary in the middle of a professional gathering. The meeting was paused. Harlan was asked with quiet firmness to step out, and Kai requested 5 minutes alone with Zara. The moment the door closed behind the last person, Zara turned to face him. She was composed on the outside, years of practice, but inside she was running calculations at a speed that would have impressed anyone who could see it. "I don't know what that was," she said, and her voice was steady and careful. "But I am not your wife." "I know," he said. He didn't offer a dramatic explanation. Yet he explained the way someone explains something they have already thought through clearly. There was a $3 billion acquisition in progress, a deal involving a Seoul-based family conglomerate called Park Holdings, which the firm had been pursuing for 18 months. The Park family were serious, values-driven people who had spent 2 generations building their company on the foundation of trust and personal integrity. They were flying into New York the following week for their final evaluation period, and that evaluation, Kai explained, was not limited to the business itself. Chairman Park was known for studying the people behind the numbers, the relationships, the character of the team he would be entering a long-term partnership with. The firm's board had been applying pressure on Kai for months. He was 30, unmarried, and known for being intensely private, qualities that read differently in a boardroom than they did in a personal context. Harlan had been positioning himself as the solution to that image problem, collecting leverage wherever he could find it, and tonight had been his attempt to remove a person who made him look insufficient by comparison. Kai had not planned to walk in and say what he said. He had walked in late, read the room, and made a decision. Now he was offering Zara a choice: 6 weeks, a contractual arrangement. She would present as his wife during the period the Park family was in New York. In exchange, Harlan's false accusation would be buried with evidence, her position would be reinstated at a senior level, and she would receive a financial settlement substantial enough to pay off her mother's mortgage and fund something else, something he mentioned in a way that told her he had not arrived at it by accident. "The legal non-profit," he said, "the one you outlined in a brief 2 years ago, the footnote on page 9. Zara went still. "How do you know about that?" she asked, and her voice had a new quality in it, not alarm, but the careful attention of someone who has just noticed that the room they are standing in is slightly different than they assumed. "It was in a brief you submitted on the Larson case," he said. "Most people would have skimmed it." He said nothing more than that. He slid the folder across the table and told her to read every word, and that he would have his answer by morning. Then he left. And Zara sat alone in the empty boardroom with a folder, a question she couldn't yet fully form, and a view of the city that suddenly looked very different than it had an hour ago. She did not go home and sit with her uncertainty. That was not who she was. She went home and she worked. She pulled every public filing associated with Weston Capital's Park Holdings pursuit. She cross-referenced the acquisition timeline against Kai's known travel schedule. She verified the Park family's business philosophy through 3 separate industry profiles and one lengthy translated interview with Chairman Park that had run in a sole financial publication the previous year. By 1 in the morning, she had confirmed that everything Kai told her was accurate, the deal was real, and the stakes were exactly what he said they were. She also pulled the internal document records that Harlan had used to build his accusation, and within 40 minutes, she had found the thread. A timestamp that didn't match, a metadata trail that pointed not to her computer, but to a shared drive that Harlan himself had access permissions for. She didn't have the full picture yet, but she had enough to know the shape of it. She opened Kai's contract and read every line twice. Then she got out a pen. She did not approach the amendments defensively. She approached them the way she approached every contract, strategically, with clarity about what she needed and precision about how to protect it. Boundaries of conduct, communication protocols, a clause that gave her the right to terminate the arrangement within 24 hours if any element of it was misrepresented to her. And one final amendment that she added last, a provision that her professional reinstatement would be documented and distributed to the full board in writing, not handled quietly. She would not be restored in the shadows. It would be on record. 7 amendments total. She clipped them to the front of the folder and went to sleep at 2:30 in the morning. She arrived at his office the next day exactly on time. She set the folder on his desk without preamble. He looked at the amendments clipped to the front of it, and then he looked at her, and something moved through his expression, not surprise, but something adjacent to it. The look of a person recalibrating slightly. "You negotiated my contract," he said. "I negotiated a fair one," she said. "There's a difference." He read every amendment carefully and without reaction, but he agreed to 6 of them without discussion. The 7th, the public board documentation, he paused on, not because he disagreed with it, but because he wanted to understand her reasoning fully before he signed anything. She explained it in 2 sentences. He listened, then proposed a modification that actually strengthened her position beyond what she'd written. She considered it for a moment, and then agreed. They signed. They shook hands. And Zara Collins became, on paper, the one thing she had never planned to be. What followed was a series of preparation sessions that were, at the outset, entirely professional. They needed a coherent story, a timeline of how they met, how long they had been together, the kind of small personal details that hold up under warm and careful scrutiny. See, building that story required actually knowing each other. And knowing each other, it turned out, was not a simple task when both people involved were genuinely private. Kai was precise. He answered every question directly and offered nothing beyond the question. He made his own coffee every morning, not as a statement, just as a habit, the kind that had been in place long enough that delegating it would have felt strange. He kept a paperback on the corner of his desk, its spine bent and soft from reading, and it was never a book she would have predicted from a man in his position. It was a collection of essays by a little-known South Korean architect who wrote about the relationship between space and memory. When he disagreed with something Zara said during their sessions, he did not argue. He simply went quiet. Yes, and she learned within the first week that the quiet meant he was thinking, and that what came back after the quiet was always more precise than whatever she'd originally said. She noticed that he spoke about his father's firm without pride and without resentment, just a kind of careful, ongoing responsibility, like something he had accepted fully and was still in the process of understanding. Zara, for her part, was structured and direct. She brought notes to every session. She asked follow-up questions that revealed she had retained details from conversations 3 days earlier, and Kai noticed this, the way she would reference something offhand that most people would have let pass. She never asked for acknowledgement for anything she did. When an assistant in the hallway was spoken to dismissively by a senior partner, Zara addressed it quietly and without drama, and then continued walking as though it had not required any particular courage. They were not falling into anything. They were, carefully and without planning to, becoming honest with each other. And that, it turned out, was considerably more disarming than either of them had anticipated. The Park family arrived on a Wednesday evening, and by Thursday night they were gathered around a long dinner table in a private room of a midtown restaurant, Chairman Park at the head, his daughter Soo-yeon to his left, Kai and Zara across from her. Chairman Park was in his late 60s, with the particular warmth of someone who has spent a lifetime reading people and decided, somewhere along the way, to be kind about what he found. But he asked questions about the firm with genuine curiosity rather than evaluation, and he listened to Kai's answers in a way that suggested he was paying attention to the spaces between the words as much as the words themselves. Su-Yan was different. She was mid-30s, sharp and direct, with a way of looking at a person that felt less like assessment and more like attention. She turned to Zara early in the evening and began asking her questions, not about the firm, not about Kai, but about her work, her thinking, the way she approached problems. Zara answered honestly, without performance, and Su-Yan listened with the focused engagement of someone who respects a direct answer. As the evening moved forward, the details that Zara and Kai had gathered about each other surfaced in the conversation naturally. The coffee, the paperback, the notebooks, and they landed with a quiet weight that no rehearsed answer could have manufactured, because they were true. They had observed each other carefully enough that when they spoke about each other, they were not constructing a story. They were reporting one. Then Su-Yan set down her glass and said, in the warm but unhurried way she said most things, "What I find rare is two people who are still genuinely curious about each other. Tell me, what is something about him that still surprises you?" She was looking at Zara. The table was quiet, the kind of quiet that has a texture to it. Zara didn't reach for anything prepared. She looked at Kai for a moment, just a moment, and then she said truthfully, "He pays attention to things most people walk past, and he never makes a show of it." Kai was very still. The Chairman Park looked between them with a small, settled smile, the smile of a man who has just confirmed something he suspected from the beginning of the evening. 2 days after the dinner, Su-Yan's assistant contacted Zara directly to arrange a private lunch. No Kai, no advance explanation of the agenda, just a time and a restaurant. Zara went. The lunch began easily. Good food, genuine conversation, the kind of exchange that happens between two people who think in similar ways and find that unexpectedly pleasant. Su-Yan asked about the Collins Foundation, the non-profit that Zara had mentioned briefly the evening before, and Zara found herself talking about it with more detail than she usually offered anyone. The vision for it, the gap it was meant to fill, the women it was designed to help. Or Su-Yan listened with complete attention. And then, near the end of the meal, she set down her cup, and her voice shifted, not to something cold, but to something careful and direct. "I want to be honest with you," she said, "because I think you are someone who values honesty more than comfort." Zara held her gaze and said nothing. "I've looked at the timeline carefully. The details don't align the way they should if this were what it's been presented as. I'm not raising this to cause difficulty." She paused. "I'm raising it because my father trusts people, genuinely and fully, and I have spent 20 years making sure that trust is not misplaced. So I'm asking you directly, what is real here? And what isn't?" The table between them felt very small. Zara could have redirected. She was skilled enough. She could have introduced enough ambiguity to make the question feel answered without actually answering it. She knew how to do that. It was, in a narrow sense, part of what she was being paid for. But she sat across from this woman who had been direct with her from the first moment, who had asked about her work and her vision, and listened to the answers as though they mattered, and she found that she did not want to give her a performance. She took a breath. She didn't lay out the contractual mechanics, but she told the truth underneath them. She said that she and Kai had begun as strangers to each other, that she had entered a professional arrangement under circumstances that she had evaluated carefully and agreed to with full knowledge of what it was, that she had not expected any part of it to become genuine, but more than I expected to, and I think he more than I expected to, and I think he sees me in a way I'm not entirely used to being seen. Su-Yan was quiet for a long moment. She looked at Zara with an expression that was neither judgment nor sympathy, just the clear, settled attention of someone deciding what they actually think. Then she picked up her cup. "That," she said, "is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in a business context in a very long time. My father will have his answer." Zara walked out of that restaurant on steady legs, but something inside her was moving in a way that had nothing to do with the deal, or the contract, or the 6-week arrangement she had signed her name to. She had said something out loud that she hadn't fully admitted to herself yet. And now, it was real in the way that spoken things become real, sitting out in the open, unable to be folded back up and tucked away. She went to Kai that evening without waiting to be contacted. She told him everything, the lunch, the question, her answer. She did not frame it as a complication that needed managing. She framed it as a decision she had made, and she sat in the chair across from him with the same steadiness she brought to every difficult conversation, because she had done nothing she was not willing to account for. Kai listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet she now recognized, the one that meant he was organizing something important before he spoke. "You could have redirected her," he said. "I know. Why didn't you?" "Because she deserved a real answer," Zara said, "and because I was tired of the version of this story where I'm only reacting to what other people decide." Something in his face opened, very slightly and very briefly, but she caught it. In 6 weeks of paying careful attention to this man, she had learned to catch the small things. Then he told her what he had been holding privately. He opened a drawer and placed a file on the desk between them, a documentation of Harlan's pattern going back further than Zara had known to look, credit taken for other people's work, pressure applied to team members who challenged him, and at the center of it, it had the fabricated timestamp that formed the foundation of the accusation against her, traced back through the metadata to a login that was not Zara's. "I've been building this for months," he said. "I was going to bring it forward when the timing protected the firm." Zara looked at the file. Then she reached into her bag, pulled out a document she had printed that afternoon, and set it on top of his. "3 corroborating sources," she said. "I found the metadata trail last week. I was waiting until I had enough to make it airtight." He looked at what she had placed in front of him. Then he looked at her. "You were building the same case," he said. "I was protecting myself," she said, "the way I always have." They brought it to the board together, not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a clear and thorough presentation of documented evidence, delivered with the kind of precision that left no room for misinterpretation. Harlan Reed was removed from the firm. Zara's professional reinstatement was documented and distributed to the full board in writing, exactly as her 7th Amendment had required. The Park acquisition closed at the end of the week. Chairman Park sent a handwritten note to Kai that was brief and characteristically direct. It said, "The people around you tell you who you are. You chose well." Suyan sent a separate message to Zara. It said only, "The foundation will do important work. I look forward to following it." The 6 weeks ended on a Tuesday. Kai's office, the same desk, the same 2 chairs, the same view of the city that Zara had looked at the very first night when nothing had made sense yet. The exit clause was printed and sitting on the desk between them. Neither of them reached for it. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have become honest enough with each other that they can sit without filling the space. Then Kai said, carefully, the way he said everything that mattered to him, 3 months ago, I walked into a boardroom and said something I hadn't planned to say." "I remember," Zara said. "I've been thinking about it since." The 4 words, the fact that they weren't entirely wrong. Zara looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Everything she had carried into this arrangement, the carefulness, the structure, or the professional distance she had maintained like a well-drafted clause, she felt it all very clearly right now. She also felt, with equal clarity, that she was done pretending it was the whole of what she thought. She picked up the exit clause, folded it once, and set it to the side of the desk. "Then let's stop pretending it was only a contract," she said, "and find out what it actually is." Kai looked at the folded paper, then at her, and for the first time in the entire length of their acquaintance, he smiled, fully, without the careful management he applied to most things he felt. "I'll make coffee," he said. "Make enough for 2, she said. 3 months after that, the Collins Foundation opened its doors in a bright, clean office space on the 4th floor of a building in Lower Manhattan. Like legal aid and professional advocacy for working women who could not afford to fight unfair dismissals alone. Women who had been where Zara had been, talented and prepared and standing in a room while someone tried to take from them what they had built. Zara's mother sat in the front row at the opening. wearing the good coat she reserved for occasions she wanted to remember. She had the expression of a woman who had worked 30 years for this moment without knowing exactly what shape it would take, and who recognized it immediately when it arrived. Zara stood at the front of the room and spoke about the foundation with the directness she brought to everything. No performance, no flourish. Just the clear and honest version of why it existed and what it intended to do. People listen the way people listen when they can tell that what they're hearing is real. Kai was at the back of the room. He had not been introduced or announced. He was simply there, standing near the door with his own coffee, watching her speak with an expression that was entirely unguarded, the particular look of a private person in a moment they are not constructing for anyone else. When Zara finished and the room moved into conversation and warm noise, she found him across it, the same distance as a boardroom. She raised an eyebrow, the same look she had given him that very first night, across a different table, when 4 words had upended everything she thought she knew about how the evening would end. He raised his cup. One quiet nod. And Zara Collins, who had walked into a glass boardroom 40 floors above the city expecting the worst night of her career, allowed herself, fully and without reservation, to smile back. Zara Collins walked into that boardroom expecting the worst night of her life. What she didn't know was that someone had been quietly watching her work for 2 years, not to claim it, but because he recognized something rare. And what Kai Weston didn't know was that the woman he stepped forward for that night didn't need saving. She needed space to show everyone, including him, exactly who she had always been. They began with 4 words and a contract. They ended with something neither of them had a clause for, something that, for the first time, neither of them wanted to negotiate their way out of. And that is contractually yours. If this story stayed with you, now please give it a thumbs up. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who love stories like this one. And if you are new here, subscribe right now so you never miss the next story. I put everything into every episode, and I am so grateful you were here for this one. I'll see you in the next one.